Hi everybody, I'm Seanson, chairperson of the You Don't Have to Reinvent the Wheel Society for Not Reinventing Wheels, and welcome to Obscure and Forgotten PS1 Games Volume 15, yet another long drawn out video about cool old video games, and we wouldn't have it any other way. Viewer selection rules are still in effect, which means we've got 4 juicy picks straight from the hearts and minds of the lovely people who watch this show, so if you don't like what you see, you know who to blame. Anyway, since I've now filled the pointless banter quota for this intro, it's time to get onto the show, so sit back, relax, and make yourself comfy because your old pal the wheel is back and ready to provide.
You will provide.
Once upon a time, in another world, in another dimension, the destiny of the universe was being played in a battle between good and evil. The legend would be born. Sword and blood.
Welcome to Legend.
Kicking things off today, we have a game called Legend, which made its way to the PlayStation in December of the year 1998, and would you believe it, it's yet another PAL exclusive.
Not another one? Oh, for God's sake, I can't stand this.
Hey, don't worry old British lady, this one is actually a pretty interesting pick, and it comes courtesy of the lovely Nocturnal. Thank you for further contributing to Pal Palson's 50Hz extravaganza. Now this game is a pretty interesting pick for 2 reasons. One is that it is a rather obscure console exclusive arcade style beat 'em up on the PlayStation, one that also happens to be a full-on remake of an obscure console exclusive arcade style beat 'em up on the Super Nintendo, which is also unsurprisingly called Legend and launched in 1994, making this PS1 version one of the earlier remakes in gaming history. And the second reason is that Legend on the PS1 is another game from French developer Toka, who fans of the show might remember as the developers of Burning Road, which has gone on to be quite the favourite from this series. Well, at least according to my comments anyway, but come on now, who could hate Burning Road?
Burning Road. Burning Road.
Now, Burning Road wasn't exactly a masterpiece, but one thing that I took away from my experience with it is that Toka was clearly a very talented development team, considering they made both Burning Road and Legend with a core dev team of just 4 people, which is frankly ridiculous. But more crucially, their games have this very distinct arcade flair and silliness to them. I guess the best way I can describe them is that they feel like long-lost Sega games in a way, certainly not as polished as a Sega game, mind you, but the influence is undeniable. And that's why I was very excited to dig into today's game Legend, as arcade beat-em-ups are one of my favourite genres, especially ones of the silly 3D variety. But before we get into Legend on the PS1, we might as well check out Legend on the Super Nintendo, so we at least know what our remake is working from. Now, I'd like to think I have a pretty good knowledge of the Super Nintendo library, but Legend has gotta be one of the least talked about Super Nintendo games out there, right? I don't think I ever recall seeing this game brought up in a video about the console, and keep in mind, this game came out both in PAL and NTSC regions. Maybe it's just the case that I need to watch more videos on the Super Nintendo, but unfortunately you don't really get much time for that when you're deep down in the PlayStation mines. As for the game itself, it's mostly your standard fantasy beat-em-up fare. The combat is a little stiff and weighty, although it does feel by design, as interestingly a lot of the combat in this game just requires you to hold down the attack button and focus on changing direction rather than needing to tap a button repeatedly to perform a combo. It actually feels a little Splatterhousey, if I'm being honest, is That even a word? Splatterhousey? Oh well, it is now. It's really nothing all that special on a gameplay level, and maybe a tad too simplistic for some, but I think if you're a beat-em-up fan who's played everything the SNES has to offer, you'll probably get a nice time out of this one. It's also got a lot of clear Golden Axe influence in parts, so I'm sure that'll pop some people. Although, a clear highlight of the game has to be the visuals, as this game is chock full of lovely environments and sprites throughout, and it even has some fun Mode 7 inclusions at the map screen, featuring this cool sword that points you to your next location, which we love to see. And when it comes to the 1998 PS1 version from Toka, Legend is a surprisingly faithful remake of the original, while also managing to expand the game in plenty of promising ways too, which is to say you can now shoot magic at dinosaurs via some magic gloves, a feature I'm sure we'd all be happy to see in most games, assuming your name is John Turok anyway. The game is still a fantasy-themed beat-em-up for 1 or 2 players, but the major difference is of course the move to 3D, which sees the game updated to feel more in line with other popular 3D beat-em-ups of its day, while still managing to feel like a throwback to the classics. If you enjoy walking from left to right and also stopping to eat meat off the ground, but now in 3D, well then you'll probably like this. Now before we dig into the quirks of Legend, we should first explain the gameplay, because there's really a lot more depth to it than you'd imagine for a game of this type. And that's something I found out quite quickly, because when I started playing, I could just not figure out how to use my magic, or whatever this bar in the bottom left was supposed to do, and that was after trying pretty much every button combination under the sun for 5 straight minutes. Now what I did figure out is that square is your basic attack combo, triangle is your kick, which is handy for opening chests or attacking smaller enemies, circle picks up items and also enemies, which is always fun. You can press X to perform the heaviest jump ever put in a video game. Seriously though, jump attacks are useless in this game thanks to how awkward this jump feels, but at least you can use it to get away from enemies on occasion, so that is something. Other than that, I found out that you can execute a heavy attack by holding R2 while pressing the attack button, and R1 does this parry attack, which turns out to be quite important. More on that later, but yeah, for the life of me, I could never figure out how to use magic or whatever this meter on the left does. Now the first port of call would of course be the manual, but unfortunately Legend is both uncommon and expensive, a terrible combination for somebody who tries to avoid paying 100 quid for a game whenever possible, and since this is also an obscure PAL exclusive, the chances of finding a manual scan online are slim at best. Now my next option is usually GameFAQs, just to see if somebody happened to make a guide for it back in the day, but alas, we got nothing. But a good little tip is to always check the Q&A section on GameFAQs to just see if anybody else is having the same issues that you are, and lo and behold, a question about how to use magic. And God bless this commentator who decided to come back and answer their own question, alongside providing a full list of all the commands in game. What a hero. So yeah, using both magic and that little bar on the left requires you to hold down both the R1 and R2 buttons simultaneously, then press a series of face buttons to activate a command. For example, you have access to 3 different magic attacks. Freeze, which blocks enemies in place for a short amount of time and costs 1 magic pot. Fire is your damage magic, and that is performed with X and triangle, and that costs you 2 magic pots. And your most powerful spell is Frog magic, which turns every enemy on screen into cute little frog sprites. Naturally, this costs you 3 magic jars, as it's clearly the best. As for the bar on the bottom left, that is your combo bar, and it's required to use combo attacks, of course. There's 4 combo commands in total that are shared across each of the game's 3 playable characters, but the attacks they'll perform will be different depending on the character you use. These attacks are by far the most powerful abilities in the game, and they range from powerful combo strings to wider attacks focused on hitting multiple enemies at once. 3 of the combos only use up a quarter of the bar on use, while 1 of them requires a full bar to use and does comically high amounts of damage. This bar fills up automatically during combat, and it fills up quite quickly too, so combos should be in constant rotation during battle. And better still, the game also features a pretty varied roster of weapons to spice up combat too. We've of course got fantasy classics like swords and battle axes, but the addition of range weapons like the crossbow, cannon and magic gloves really give you plenty of fun options for combat, and best of all, each of these weapons also feature additional attacks tied to the heavy attack and combo commands, and not only that, Many of these attacks are also unique to each character, meaning each character in this game has roughly 30 or 40 unique attack options available to them across their basic moveset as well as the game's 8 different weapons. It's a really good way of overcoming the repetitiveness that usually comes with the genre, as the game is constantly giving you new abilities to play around with as the game goes on. It doesn't mean the combat itself isn't still quite basic and repetitive in nature, but because I've got so many fun attacks and weird enemies to use them on, it never really feels that way, you know? Something I also found quite interesting in game is the decision to give you a parry instead of a traditional block. Because when I played through this game on easy initially, it felt like a pretty standard beat 'em up gameplay and difficulty wise, with rarely any need to parry in standard combat situations. Whereas if you turn the game up to medium or hard, the enemies become much tougher to take out and begin to block some of your basic attacks too, meaning parrying and combo usage becomes way more important on higher difficulties, especially considering combos also make you immune to damage when in use, making combat a little more involved and tactical on higher difficulties, although personally I just enjoy the mindlessness of easy. I mean, I've got no time to think when I'm holding a comically sized sword, you know? So now that we know the basics of combat, which may I remind you is only thanks to a random Q&A post on GameFAQs, let's take a look at how the different characters further affect the gameplay. We have 3 different characters to choose from: average man, fast woman, and heavy man. The 3 archetypes. Axel, who is definitely not a Streets of Rage reference, is our middle of the road character and also looks exactly like Darius out of League of Legends. Tara is our lovely lady option and also the fastest character available. Unfortunately, her square head is mildly nightmare-inducing. And finally, we have Garrow, a big, heavy boy in a suit of armor. Naturally, he's the slowest of the bunch, but he can also punch people so hard that they split in half, which is quite fun. Now, as mentioned, the 3 characters cover the usual beat-em-up archetypes, but a nice addition to their gameplay is their affinities with certain weapons. Axel tends to favor medium-weight items like swords and axes, Tara is quite strong with daggers and poles, and Garrow obviously favors heavier weapons, notably being the only character who is able to wield this giant sword without having an absolutely awful time. I seriously feel bad for poor Tara having to lug this thing around, but at the very least, it doesn't stop her from deleting characters with it. Now, truthfully, this doesn't really have a major effect on the overall gameplay, as each character is still pretty proficient with most weapons, but I did think it was a nice, thoughtful addition to help further diversify the playable characters. And yeah, that's pretty much the core gameplay in a nutshell, just doing cool shit to weird enemies on repeat across 6 levels. The levels are pretty long by beat-em-up standards, usually taking 15 to 20 minutes to complete, but each level is split into multiple smaller sections with unique locations and enemies within, which once again helps fight that feeling of repetition. Levels always end with a boss fight, which are mostly against standard size enemies, just with more powerful and varied attack patterns, although the last boss certainly does kick things up a notch in more ways than one. Now, these fights can be pretty tough, but you can still use combos to stun lock them, so you know, that's always funny to see. And in between levels, you usually get to play a fun minigame where you gotta shoot objects and enemies with a crossbow for points. These segments play really well actually, and are a nice little palate cleanser in between levels with some lovely visuals too. And better still, the gold that you earn here can then be used to pick up some items in the in-game store. You see, beyond the usual health, weapon, and magic pickups, enemies might also drop money and treasure, which can then be picked up and later spent at this store, which appears before you start a new level. Here you can buy lives, health, weapons, magic armor, you name it. Ideally, you'll want to stock up on lives above all else, but it is nice to be able to kick off a new level with your favorite weapon in hand and just start blasting dogs with some magic gauntlets thanks to your absolutely immense wealth. And I think that kind of sums up what makes Legend a standout beat 'em up on the console. It's very traditional in terms of its flow and design, but it adds all these little extras like the combos, the varied weapons, the minigames, the item shop, and just kind of relishes in being this incredibly silly and over-the-top video game. I mean, when I booted this game up and went into the options and seen that there was a toggle for blood that was set to off by default, I needed to see what kind of gore this game was hiding, and upon starting it, I was immediately slicing off arms and decapitating enemies in ridiculous ways. It just makes you think Toka gets this whole video game thing, you know? Unfortunately though, in spite of how great many aspects of this game are, there's a few things which I think hold it back from true greatness, and it mostly comes at the cost of the game's exciting combat and excellent visuals. You see, for as fun and satisfying as this game's combat is, I wouldn't say the control itself is very good. Your character's movement is very heavy and deliberate, and that kind of feeds into the combat as well, which mostly feels like you're locking yourself into an animation and then just homing in on your opponents while you fight. Now, when you consider the game's default option is to auto-lock you to your opponents, that begins to make a lot more sense, but when I tried to play the game with manual lock instead, I found it was almost impossible to properly engage in combat with opponents, and almost all of my attacks that I threw out would just miss, to the point where it feels kind of unplayable without this auto-lock engage, so you just kind of have to get used to it. The game also has this habit of randomly dropping chests on your head, which is honestly kind of funny until it happens to you for like the 20th time in an hour, and it starts to become a little less funny each time, but you know, it's still kind of funny. But really though, I think it is just the movement and stiffness of the combat that really lets this game down, and I think this can be represented by your jump, which is just so comically bad. It legit might be one of the worst jumps that I've ever seen in a video game. The combat undeniably has a lot of style and impact, but it's really missing the finesse and precision that separates the top tier beat 'em ups from the crowd. Like, don't get me wrong, this game is still a ton of fun to play through, but you're always going to think in the back of your mind that this game could be so much better, which is really quite the shame. The visuals also kind of suffer the same fate too. I mean, there is no denying how incredible this game looks, especially considering the tiny dev team responsible. The environments are colourful, detailed and varied, with fun little environmental dangers to both avoid and watch destroy your enemies. The UI elements like the map screen being a throwback to the Super Nintendo original and the unique portraits for every enemy in the game are also a great touch. And speaking of the enemies, there is a ton of variety throughout, with some incredible animations across the board. The enemies even sometimes beg you for mercy, which I'm not gonna lie, never really goes too well for them. All those combo attacks and the little flourishes with the weapons also look fantastic for the time, and considering how much is often happening on screen, the performance is top notch too, and that's in single player and co-op. It's just unfortunate that these excellent visuals also come with some drawbacks too, namely the number of times that your screen is going to be completely obscured by an object in the foreground, or how insanely busy combat scenes can often be, making it difficult to make sense of anything at all that you're seeing on the screen in front of you. There's also some really aggressive flashing, which I get is kind of a staple of old arcade games, but the magic attacks in particular really start to do your eyes in after a while, which is quite the shame because the magic attacks are very useful, but I legit avoided using them at times just so I could spare my eyeballs the strain. Legend is a beautiful mess. I think that's a good way to describe it. Sometimes it's one of the prettiest games you've seen on the console, other times it's trying to give you polygonal-based nightmares for the next few weeks. Also, the CGI scenes, they are really something else. Now, the audio, on the other hand, pretty strong across the board. Well, except maybe for the voice lines, which are very clearly the same dude from Burning Road, and as you'd expect, these range from hilarious
Let the legend begin.
to practically unintelligible. Where the audio really shines though, is in the background music and sound effects. You see, the music provides this epic background layer that completely fits the vibe and aesthetic of the levels and combat, while the sound effects are a mixture of sword swooshes and armor clanks, and also some of the dumbest video gamey ass shit that you've ever heard. For example, listen to this sound effect that plays whenever you fire the cannon. Isn't that amazing? The sound plays such a big part in making this game as fun as it is, and if you love video games that take pride in being noisy, over the top, and also having people yell at you to walk to the right, well then this is about as good as it gets. So that's a look at Legend, a game that sure does have some problems, but is so unashamedly a video game that I think it's hard not to like. If you love classic side-scrolling beat-em-ups and loud, flashing arcade games, you're gonna enjoy this game, no doubt about it. I get the odd movement and somewhat complicated combo system might be a barrier of entry for some people, but trust me, just read the GameFAQs Q&A or pay £100 for a manual, and you'll be good to go. If anything, between playing both this and Burning Road, I'm now incredibly interested in playing more of Toka's games, and while the PlayStation ones are generally quite pricey, the rest of their game catalogue post PS1 sure isn't. I mean, who doesn't want to play Sky Surfer or the Flintstones Viva Rock Vegas on the PS2? What do you mean you don't want to surf the sky or Yabba Dabba Drift? Their only Dreamcast release, a game called Soul Fighter, is especially interesting since this is more or less Legend 2 in everything but name, and a further continuation of their beat-em-up formula. Some people seem to either love or hate this one, but it is most certainly a video game, I'll tell you that much. And another standout is their final game called Hidden Invasion, which feels like another expansion of their beat-em-up formula, only now it's futuristic and focuses on guns for some reason. And it's also kinda bad. Maybe we'll talk about those games some more in the future, you know, if I ever decide to do anything with all these PS2 games I've been stocking up on. But for now at least, we all know Legend is truly a game for the gamers, and also people who like to shoot lasers at dinosaurs, although, let's be fair, that's really one and the same, isn't it?
You will provide.
Next up, we have Reloaded, the 1996 follow-up to another early PlayStation release, which unsurprisingly is called Loaded. This game was chosen for us today by three lovely people, them being Russie B. Cool, Murpheus93, and Ginge, and it's a pretty nostalgic game for me personally, as it's one of the very first PlayStation games that I can ever recall playing. And as such, it's also one of the oldest games in my collection, and I mean, who doesn't love a big old PAL box for a 1-disc game? It's the same size as the box for Riven, and that came with 5 discs, so it's an impressive waste of space if you think about it, but a cool one all the same. Now the thing with Reloaded, and I suppose my experience with it personally, is that it's impossible to review this game without talking about its predecessor, Loaded, because on the surface, they seem more or less like the exact same game, and in a way they are, or at least they would be, if they also weren't completely different. So, in an unusual twist for this show, seeing as somebody has also submitted Loaded as a pick for the viewer wheel, we're going to turn this section into a dual review, covering both Loaded and Reloaded. So, congrats to the man himself, RJ Badman, for being yet another person to default their way into getting picked on the show, you lucky devil.
Default! Default!
So, of course, naturally, since Loaded came before Reloaded, we might as well start here, and would you believe it, this also came with a juicy big box for a single disc game, and my god, do they look great. Although here, you can actually see the purpose of these larger boxes, as in Europe, sometimes games got shipped with 2 separate manuals to cover multiple different languages. Now this is especially funny to think about when you consider how simple and straightforward a game Loaded is, but we'll get to that shortly, and by shortly, I mean right now. So Loaded, in a nutshell, is a hyper-violent, blood-pumping, top-down shooter all about navigating a series of complex mazes with the goal of getting the hell out of there. You'll collect power-ups, coloured keycards to unlock doors, and in the middle of all that, you'll also be gunning down countless waves of enemies, all of which leave this delightful bloodstain on the ground to remind you of all the fun that you had shooting them. Now this style of top-down shooter was especially popular during the early to mid-90s. I guess at its core you could say this game is just a more flashy version of the '85 Atari classic Gauntlet, which is really the forebearer of this style of game, but personally I think of games like Zombies Ate My Neighbors, those cool Jurassic Park games, and also that criminally overlooked True Lies game, which is an absolute banger. Now these would be popular examples of this genre, but one thing to consider here is that Loaded was developed by a British studio called Gremlin Interactive, who were a pretty big deal in the UK, having a number of very high profile hits across the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, Amiga, BBC Micro, you name it. And while Loaded does have a lot of similarities to many popular American games of its day, it mostly seems to be influenced by 2 very popular British releases, namely Alien Breathe from Team 17 and the Chaos Engine from the Bitmap Brothers, 2 games you may or may not know a whole bunch about, but in the UK at least these were very highly regarded, often being considered 2 of the best Amiga games period. So Gremlin Graphics, or Gremlin Interactive as they were now known, had an opportunity to make a big splash on Sony's brand new console, and they thought this already well established top-down shooter genre was the way to go, and in late 1995, Loaded made its way to North American shores, followed closely by the PAL release in early 1996, and also a little later in Japan under the now incredibly cool name of Blood Factory. And I gotta give it to them, not many games have 3 unique cover art variations which are equally as good as the other, but this game does. And a big reason why that might be is the characters were created in collaboration with comic legends Garth Ennis, who you might know for his work on Preacher and the Boys, and also Greg Staples, notable for his work with 2000 AD and Judge Dredd in particular. So in other words, Loaded is essentially peak mid-90s edginess in video game form, and its wacky cast of bloodthirsty characters are certainly a testament to that. You can get a lot more backstory to these characters in the manual of course, but the plot of this game is quite simple. You play as one of 6 psychotic prisoners who are being set up by a character known only as FUB, which stands for Fat Ugly Bastard by the way, and unfortunately for him, our characters have now broken out of prison, and so begins a blood-soaked journey for revenge against Mr. FUB, and really that's about all you need to know. There's plenty of places to go and plenty of things to shoot. What more could you want? The game is playable solo or in co-op with another player, which ideally is the best way to experience this game in my opinion. Each character has access to a basic projectile attack and an AoE special, both of which are unique to them, and their speed and armor values also vary from character to character. The 6 available to choose from are Fwank, the poster boy of the series, a psychotic dude who wears a bank bag on his head painted with clown makeup. He has a big neutron cannon that shoots fireballs, and his AoE attack is homing explosive teddy bears, which, as you imagine, are quite effective. Then we have Bouncer, who, if the name didn't give it away, is an ex-bouncer turned killer for hire. He has a lovely suit and also a big muzzle, a strapping combination, in my opinion. His weapon is a big rapid-fire missile launcher that has a slight homing effect, and his AoE attack is tons of micro missiles. Next up we have Mama, an incredibly large man with the mind of an infant, and also gets his name from the fact that Mama is the only thing he can say. Now in spite of that, he's actually pretty good at killing things thanks to his plasma baby bottle and ripple grenades, which send out this cool little shockwave effect on the ground. After that we have Butch, who in their own words is the OG gender offender. Not only does Butch get a nice purple dress, but they're the only character in game to have a short range weapon, as they use a flamethrower, and their AoE is a big ring of fire. Probably the toughest character to use in my opinion, but also the only one that leaves burnt out silhouettes of defeated enemies, so that's kind of fun. Next up we have Vox, another character that fills our singular lovely lady quota. Vox has the lowest armor value in the game, but is also the quickest, so they're probably the speedrunner's choice I'd imagine. She also has a bunch of sound-based weaponry that makes enemies explode, both via her basic shots and AoE, so a great choice for sure. But the best character, and the one that I imagine most players of this game fondly remember, is Captain Hans, part pirate, part skeleton cyborg. thing. This dude has 2 flintlock pistols which absolutely decimate enemies, and his AoE, which is a dark shroud of negative energy, also decimates enemies. Long story short, he is both the coolest and most effective character of the bunch, and as such, you'll be seeing him during most of today's footage. So once you pick your character and get into game, you'll find that Loaded really is just shooting dudes and finding keycards. You've of course got your 2 attacks. There's a button you can hold down to sprint, which I honestly think I never let go of during this playthrough. And of course, since this isn't a twin stick shooter, you're actually going to have to aim your shots, although there is a strafe button too, which you should also be using 24/7. Beyond that, there's items to pick up that restore your health, power up your weapon, which has 5 levels and resets upon death, and there's also ammo for both your main weapon and your AoE weapons, and if you're very, very lucky, you might even find an extra life, but these are generally quite rare. Although if you like, you can give yourself a few extra lives in the options menu before starting, so go ahead, you might as well treat yourself. The gameplay is really just moving from area to area, killing everything in sight, and then you search around for a key card that will give you access to a new area, and then you do that on repeat until you eventually leave. It's most certainly quite fun, but admittedly, it is also very, very simple, and when you consider this is the basic formula across all 15 levels of the game, it is also very repetitive. There's no additional weaponry or items outside of your stock character abilities. The enemy variety is essentially dude that runs at you, dude that shoots at you, bigger dude that shoots at you, big machine that shoots at you, or tiny enemies that ruin your life. These rats in particular are the bane of my existence, let me tell you. There are boss fights, I guess you could say, if you consider the same few brief fights against Fat Ugly Bastard all that exciting. Also, the levels tend to get larger and more confusing as the game goes on, often seeing you wander around aimlessly if you happen to not check one of the dozens of available rooms and happen to just miss out on the item that you needed to progress further. There is thankfully a handy minimap which you can display instead of your health and ammo bars, although since it's quite small and doesn't indicate areas you've visited previously, it's certainly not as useful as it could be. Really, when you break it down, it's legit one of the most simple examples of the genre out there, with pretty much every other example that I previously mentioned offering way more variety and depth on a basic gameplay level. Now, I'm not saying going for a simple back-to-basic approach to the gameplay is bad per se, but considering this was meant to be a next-gen take on an established genre, you certainly feel like they could have done more to keep the gameplay engaging from level to level. I mean, it's not even that long a game, taking about 2 to 3 hours total to complete its 15 levels, but it's the type of game where it's really best enjoyed in shorter bursts, maybe tackling 2 or 3 levels per session, as it really helps avoid the fatigue that will inevitably set in during longer play sessions. Now, even taking this into consideration, Loaded was a pretty big hit back in the day, well, at least over here in the UK and Ireland anyway, because in spite of its simple gameplay, Loaded really managed to win people over thanks to its dark and violent visuals, fancy visual effects for the time, and excellent soundtrack, which, in my opinion, more or less carries this game really. Levels and environments are often dark, filthy, and oppressive, giving this really uneasy vibe throughout the game, which matches really well with its psychotic and dark characters, and the lighting effects and gore just add that little extra something to the gunplay, which makes it feel constantly satisfying in spite of the admittedly simple gameplay. You see, we were still in the pretty early days of the console's life cycle here, and most of the graphically impressive titles out there were either racing or fighting games, so even something as simple as 2D sprites in a fully rendered 3D environment with explosives and lighting effects was pretty mind-blowing at the time, and this was more than enough to sell people on the game. But personally, I think it's the music and sound effects that sell the experience the most, as Loaded's soundtrack is pretty much all killer, no filler throughout. Now, something I'm yet to highlight is that RJ Badman specifically requested that I play the PAL version of this game, and the reason is that this version includes a few extra tracks from the band Pop Will Eat itself that aren't in the North American version. There's 2 tracks in total that play both in select levels and on the main menu, and I won't lie, these are so good to experience in-game that I legit think they just enhance the overall experience of the game. By the way, if you're the kind of person that cares a lot about PAL versus NTSC framerate issues, but still want the pop will eat itself tracks, they do seem to be included in the Japanese release Blood Factory, so there is an option out there for the 50Hz haters. Although personally, I found performance pretty comparable across all versions, which is to say you'll see the game's frame rate fluctuate wildly depending on how much crap is on screen and no matter which version you play, so I wouldn't really stress about it too much. As for the non-commercial music tracks in game, these were all composed by longtime Gremlin composer Neil Biggin, and these are also really damn good. Unfortunately, there's only 6 unique tracks in the game, so you're gonna see them repeated across a few of the levels, even more so if you're playing the North American release, but they're so good, they're pretty much the first thing I think about when it comes to Loaded, and even if the gameplay can be a bit mindless and repetitive, the music and squibby sound effects always manage to keep the adrenaline up, and you love to see it. And that's Loaded in a nutshell really. If you like simple co-op games about shooting stuff with banging tunes and dark edgy characters, it's a pretty fun time. Could its gameplay be more fleshed out and varied? Yeah, absolutely, and like I said, it's definitely a game best played in shorter bursts, but it's still a fun experience overall, and kind of an icon of the PlayStation's early gritty years in my opinion. It even has a Saturn port for the Sega fans out there, and it's a pretty good one too, so you really can't go wrong with either. Anyway, that's Loaded out of the way, so let's see if things got better or worse in the follow-up Reloaded, and I'll give you a heads up. Things are about to get worse. Here's Reloaded, which made its way to the PlayStation in late 1996, less than a year after the original, and once again from Gremlin Interactive. Sadly, there's no Japanese or Saturn version this time, so no cool title change, I'm afraid. Reloaded on the surface is essentially more Loaded, and when you consider how limited the Loaded formula was the first time around, you'd imagine they'd spice things up to give the game a little more variety and depth, something that might be tough to do considering its short development time, but it does seem like Gremlin listened to some of the critiques of the original and attempted to flesh out the game in new ways, although while some of the changes are most certainly an improvement, I'd say the majority of changes actually make the game actively worse than its predecessor, something you should never have to say about a sequel. We'll get into those changes in a moment, but for now, as you can see, the core gameplay is entirely unchanged. It's still a top-down shooter, it still uses the same weapon and aiming system, and it still uses a little minimap for navigation, although thankfully they've now added a little trail that shows you places you've visited previously. I think they probably could have adjusted it a little to make it more readable considering the small size of the map, but it is most certainly an improvement overall. The game once again features a roster of 6 characters, 2 of which are new, and 4 of which are returning from the original. Our returning characters are Bouncer, who now has a dashing pink suit and a new shotgun and flaming whatever this thing is. Mama, who in spite of having a new and vastly superior Blue Rabbit onesie, also has a new and much worse bottle laser and weaker seismic attack, so that kinda sucks. Butch is back as well, sporting a new dashing Baywatch style swimsuit with landmine breasts. They still have the flame AoE attack, but unfortunately lost her flamethrower, instead getting a Cap in Hand style dual Uzi, which is even more bizarre considering Cap in Hands is also in this game too, and is the character with the least amount of changes, and honestly I can't really blame him as there really is no need to change perfection. As for our two new characters, we have the poster girl of the game, known as the Consumer, a vicious cannibal who has a weird multicolored energy ball gun and this green AoE thing. I really like her design, but playing as her, not so much. And the final character, and my personal favourite of the bunch, is Sister Magpie, a cybernetic nun from hell, which, yes, is as cool as it sounds. She probably has the best basic shot in the game, but as a trade-off, she also has maybe the worst AoE attack in the game, but it's something I'm willing to live with if it means I get to play as a cyber hell nun, so yeah, you'll be seeing her a lot in this footage going forward. Now one thing I want to highlight here, and this is a definite improvement over the first game, is that each character now has their own little mini opening when you start the game, and I've always had very vivid memories of these when playing this game as a kid, mostly because they're kinda terrifying. Sometimes they're lighthearted and fun, but mostly they're pretty terrifying. They're quite short as you'd expect, but pretty impressive for the time and really helps sell the characters and their quirks, one of my favourite parts of the game for sure. Now another weird thing I want to highlight, and this is more of a personal vendetta than anything, is that a notable absentee from this game is the poster boy of the previous game, Flank. Now, it's not unusual for a game to drop a character or two in the follow-up, but interestingly, if you look at the PAL and NTSC covers for this game, the Consumer is the focus of the PAL cover, but in North America, it's still Flank and a slightly different looking Consumer. So does this mean Frank is actually in the game? Yeah, he is, but only via a cheat code. Now as a kid, we often really didn't get that many games, so to extend the life of the games that you did have, you'd often just find a cheat book and then mess around with random codes to help keep you entertained. And when I first seen this code to unlock Frank, I was very excited to try it out. You need to enter it in the character select screen, and when you do, this balloon will appear over Sister Magpie, and then it lets you play as Frank, who not only gets his own little intro cutscene, which is probably the best out of them all if I'm being honest, but to my surprise, when you load into the game, you're not playing as Frank, you're instead playing as Sister Magpie. So yeah, turns out this cheat code does not work. They went to the effort of adding the balloon, the character portrait and opening movie, but no playable Frank, and this has bothered me for about 25 years now. But lo and behold, if you play the NTSC version of Reloaded and then try the code, it does in fact let you play as Frank, who is also supposedly the strongest character in the game, but because his gunshots look like crap and are also misaligned with his weapon, we won't be seeing him much today, so quite the anticlimax, but still a fun little factoid for you, and a fine reason to opt for the NTSC version over the PAL release if you have to pick one. Anyway, back to gameplay, which once again seems the same, right? Did they add any new weapons or features to really mix up or flesh out the combat? The answer to that is no, and not only that, they actually nerfed the power of pretty much every single weapon entirely. Guns feel weaker, the AoE attacks are definitely much weaker, and not only that, items and power-ups are a lot more limited throughout this game, meaning both powering up your weapons and finding the necessary health packs to hang on to those power-ups is a much tougher time all round. Not to mention, the game now also slows your character down while you're firing your weapons, and enemies now also tend to dodge shots and do a lot more damage to you as well, killing you in mere seconds if you're caught slacking. Now you might think these are rather strange changes to make, and you know what? You'd be right, because the thing with Reloaded is instead of improving the core running and gunning gameplay, they actually set that aside somewhat in favor of making a more exploratory and puzzle-focused game, featuring larger levels with more varied objective types. Instead of each level following the same formula of collecting 4 colored keycards and getting out of there, you may now need to seek out slightly different items or destroy a specific structure or enemies, or maybe even hold off against a wave of soldiers until time runs out. Now on paper, this is probably a good change, and while some levels I do feel show off the potential of this new design philosophy, unfortunately I think it harms the experience overall, as one of the big issues in previous games was wandering around aimlessly in very large levels just looking for where it was that you needed to go, and in Reloaded, levels are now even bigger, more open, and way more likely to see you getting lost. And while the combat was a nice way to balance this out and keep the flow going in the original, this time it kind of feels like it's taking a back seat to these exploration elements with less impactful weaponry and generally much fewer enemies per level compared to the first game. Now don't get me wrong, it is still fun to shoot things, but you're probably going to be more focused on what you need to do and where you need to go versus, blowing stuff up. You see, each level starts with a brief story introduction that explains the levels and the gimmicks within. By the way, in case you were wondering, we're still after Fat Ugly Bastard after his brain escaped at the end of the last game and has now been transferred into a new body and goes by the name CHEB, which stands for Charming, Handsome, Erudite Bastard, which is actually pretty amazing, I'm not gonna lie. Now these level intros, beyond giving us a little more story and context to the game, are also quite important as they inform you of your mission objectives, and I assure you, if you skip out on these, you might actually have no idea what you need to do and will find yourself wandering in circles for days. For example, there's a level where you need to blow up a bunch of satellites to drop down a laser fence, which is basic enough, but there's another where you need to lure specific enemies into shooting these crystals, which will then shatter them to make little balls, and then you have to push them into slots to move on through the level. By the way, one of the big new features here is that the game has physics, and it's only going to cause you a whole lot of pain. Another level sees you rescuing a bunch of clones, because if there's one thing this series needed, it was an escort level, and probably the bane of most people who have played this game. There are two levels that are very heavily focused on teleporters, and they are incredibly confusing to navigate, so yeah. That's always fun. Oddly enough, there's a handful of levels here that feel like throwbacks to the original Loaded, featuring the same keycard progression system, but these levels now also have more interesting enemy types, as well as new environmental hazards and level-specific gimmicks, and honestly, these feel like some of the best designed levels in the entire series. Even though they're quite large, they manage to flow really well. Personally, I think if they stuck to this formula but just focus more on improving the gunplay and variety of weaponry while enhancing the level design and visual variety, it would have made for a much better follow-up and a definite improvement on the original. But unfortunately, the majority of levels here are often just too confusing and too large to really be considered fun, and if the gameplay is also worse as well yeah, you can see why this game is often considered a clear downgrade from the first. Now, to Gremlin's credit, there are some definite improvements here which are worth celebrating, mostly in the enemy variety and boss types, which are certainly appreciated, and I also think the visuals look a lot nicer this time around, mostly down to an increase of the environment types seen in the game, featuring more fantastical and colourful locales. It kind of tones down the grim vibes of the first entry, but honestly that game had more than enough of them, so the change here is welcome. Although that being said, this game's final level is probably the best thing in the entire series, at least on a visual level, as you end up being shrunk down to tiny size and have to defeat Cheb by roaming around his body, blowing up his teeth and nipples and planting little bombs in there to blow him up. It's incredibly disgusting, but very, very memorable, and it gives you a nice gory end credit scene for your troubles as well. And while Reloaded unfortunately has no commercial music this time around, Neil Biggin is once again back for the soundtrack, and in my opinion, it's even better than the first games. And not only that, all 12 of this game's levels feature a unique track, and they are pretty much all bangers, so even if the gameplay is lacking in this entry, the music most certainly isn't. So that's Reloaded, which is basically more loaded, but quite different and quite worse, I'm sad to say. If you liked what you've seen in the first entry and end up enjoying that one when you play it, I'd still recommend trying this one out as well, because it does have some highlights for sure, but I'd always recommend the first entry over this one, even with its flaws, as its gameplay is simply more enjoyable and features far less frustrating moments and boulder-related deaths. The series is actually quite interesting to look at retrospectively because it really maps out how both consumers and critics' opinions changed over the course of a single year. Because in early 1996, the original PS1 release of Loaded both sold and reviewed very well, but by the time the Saturn port made it out in the latter half of 96, critical opinion on it had soured somewhat, not due to the quality of the port, but because the fancy lighting effects and CD music that wowed people before was now commonplace, and the basic gameplay it offered felt even more outdated compared to the influx of new and exciting 3D titles on the horizon. And by the time Reloaded made it out at the very end of the year, not only were people not interested in a top-down run and gun, but the changes made for an even worse experience than the original, and as such, the series was pretty much dead in the water from here on out, which is a shame, because I think artistically the characters and its world had a lot of potential and were really quite memorable, to the point where I have quite a lot of fondness for this series even today. Basic, yes. Repetitive, yes. Fun, sometimes. But it is certainly dark, gritty, edgy and cool, and a nice time capsule of early PS1 and mid-90s gaming. So if you want to switch your brain off and run around as psycho criminals shooting stuff with a buddy to banging tunes, well, Loaded, and to a lesser extent Reloaded, is a fine way of doing just that. As for Gremlin, well, they continue to make a bunch more games for the PlayStation, including all those Actua sports games. I'm partial to a bit of Actua Golf too myself. N2O Nitrous Oxide, which is one for all the Crystal Meth fans out there. Sorry, I mean Crystal Method. Don't do meth. And probably their most celebrated PS1 game, Hogs of War, which was released under their new name of Infogrames Sheffield, as Gremlin was later acquired by French company Infogrames in 1999 and then later closed down just a few short years later, as is the fate of most iconic British developers. You hate to see it. But whether you're shooting some pigs with Rick Mayall, kicking a ball around the pitch, or just gunning down countless numbers of nameless grunts to cool music, you can at least tell Gremlin understood what made games fun, and that's a legacy that will last a lifetime.
You will provide.
From my childhood, I'd been told that only the strong survive, that the strong will rule, that power is the reward of a virtuous life. I led a virtuous life. I'd mastered the art of fighting. My weapons were an extension of my will. For spiritual power, I studied the ways of voodoo, the rituals of blood sacrifice, to channel the gods and unleash their wrath upon my enemies. I was to wed Keisha, eldest daughter of the Tonko tribe. The marriage of our tribes would have secured my family's control over the ruling class of Amora. The wedding rites were interrupted by my sudden murder. Though my life was taken by bitter treachery, my struggles did not end. Sometimes death is just the beginning. Akuji, the Heartless.
Next up, we have a game about a man without a heart, aptly named Akuji the Heartless, which made its way to the PlayStation in January of the year 1999. This pick comes to us courtesy of the lovely Danfer Plus, a person I assume still has a heart, or at least I hope so anyway, or else they could end up like the poor guy in this game, which as you'll see is a rather terrible fate. Akuji comes to us from the developer-publisher combo of Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Interactive, who you may know for such hits as the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, and of course all those Gex the Gecko games, which we all love so dearly. In fact, Crystal Dynamics are so proud of Gex, he even appears on the box for Akuji, because if there's one way to sell a game, it's Gex, baby, let me tell you. Now this is the first time a Crystal Dynamics or Eidos game has appeared in the series. It's not the first time they appeared on the channel, because they also made a bunch of Disney games back in the day. I mean, who could forget Walt Disney's Magical Racing Tour starring Tiara Damage, am I right? But in the pantheon of Crystal Dynamics releases, Akuji often has this reputation of being the forgotten Crystal Dynamics game, as it had the misfortune of being released quite close to Gex 3 and Soul Reaver, which is arguably the height of their popularity on the console, both critically and commercially. Gex 3, of course, taking the popular 3D mascot platformer to even wackier and more titillating places. Plus, you can also drive a tank, which is always a big seller. And Soul Reaver was this beautifully dark and ambitious action-adventure title that continued to raise the bar for narrative storytelling in video games, pretty much establishing Amy Hennig as a force in the industry from this point on. Poor Akuji, on the other hand, very much a regular old video game really, and in many ways kind of like an amalgamation of Gex and Soul Reaver, which is to say it's built on the Gex engine and structurally plays quite similar to a mascot platformer, but it's also incredibly dark, gruesome, and visually reminiscent of what we would later see in Soul Reaver, which coincidentally was also built on the Gex engine. So in other words, what we have here is effectively a 3D mascot platformer, but for adults, starring a man who's had his heart ripped out. And I don't know about you, but if somebody tried to sell me a game nowadays as Gex meets Soul Reaver, I'd be all over that in a heartbeat. No pun intended. So let's see what Akuji the Heartless offers up all these years later. Now the plot for Akuji is legit quite interesting because thematically, it's heavily rooted in the world of voodoo and Haitian rituals, which is a really underutilized theme in video games. It's actually quite funny that both Akuji and Shadow Man happen to release in the same year, because otherwise voodoo representation in video games has been quite limited, not counting Voodoo Vince of course. God, I love this game. Anyway, our story centers around the titular Akuji, a voodoo warrior priest who's had his heart ripped out on his wedding day and is now cursed to wander the underworld forever. Although, as is video game tradition, Akuji's wife Kesho appears in spirit form to tell him the person responsible for this heinous act is in fact Akuji's own brother Orad, who is now preparing the families for war while also attempting to sacrifice Kesho to the gods, which for obvious reasons is very bad. Luckily, Baron Samedi, aka the cool guy with a top hat and sunglasses you often see referenced in other media, is here to save the day and offers you a chance to escape the underworld by collecting as many video game MacGuffins as possible, those MacGuffins being the shrunken heads of your ancestors. And oh yeah, you might also need to defeat a few Wardens of Hell as well, you know, nice lighthearted stuff. Now the game isn't as story heavy as something like Soul Reaver for example, but its inclusion and focus on the world of voodoo and Haitian culture is a huge highlight of the game, and for the sake of spoilers, I won't delve too much into it from here, but all you really need to know is that Akuji is voiced by the late great Richard Roundtree, who you might also know as the guy who played Shaft, further proving that when it comes to voicing characters in video games, Crystal Dynamics will never let you down. As for the gameplay, yeah, this thing really is quite reminiscent of a 3D mascot platformer, with some action and puzzle elements thrown in for fun. It's quite a funny contrast really, because it's this very dark world full of macabre environments and gruesome creatures, but you're also running around collecting little totems and skulls like some sort of undead Mario. I can see the unusual mixture of gameplay and tone to be quite jarring for some, but as somebody who adores cutesy 3D platformers, it's nice to play something in that style that's, you know, actually aimed at my age group and lets me relish in the gory goodness that is cutting a snake demon in half. The game structure will be very familiar to most. We have a central hub with a variety of individual levels that open up to reveal more levels as you progress through the game. The levels themselves are quite linear in flow. It's not a big open collectathon platformer like Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie. Rather, the levels go from one area to the next, with the opportunity to explore said areas for the odd secret items or ever so important Ancestor Soul. Each level contains a grand total of 4 Ancestor Souls to collect, and to progress through to the next set of levels, you have to collect a certain quota of souls from those levels and then just defeat a boss. It's about as formulaic a PS1 platformer as they come, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't done really, really well. Another thing this game also does really well is its controls, which is to say it has analog movement, and that in itself is quite the treat. Although sadly, the right stick isn't in use for camera control, so we'll still need to use the old L1 and R1 buttons for that, but it does work well enough, and the R2 button also doubles as a first-person view and a way to center the camera in a pinch. Now, Akuji himself isn't the most dynamic or movement-focused character out there. He has a single jump, he can grab onto ledges, he can climb ladders and monkey bars, crawl under things, and even do a fun little dodge roll. It's a pretty basic list of moves for a game of this type, but they perfectly complement the level design featured throughout the game. Akuji's movement is a little heavier than most platformers, but I'd say in general it's pretty high up there if we're comparing it to other titles of its day, as I don't think I ever really had a problem with movement or platforming in this game outside of the odd bit of finicky ledge grabbing, but other than that, yeah, it's pretty damn good. Although platforming is just one part of Akuji's gameplay, as combat is another big factor, and I'm delighted to say, it is also quite good. Akuji has access to a range of melee attacks using these blades attached to his arms, which you can activate via the circle button. You can tap it repeatedly for a combo, or you can do things like jump attacks or uppercuts in combination with the jump button. Admittedly, the animation for these melee attacks are a little bit jittery, I guess you could say. It kind of looks like it's quickly jumping from frame to frame without fully letting the animation play out, but I will say it's quite effective all the same. There's an ever so slight bit of auto lock in play while you're using your melee attacks, but it honestly feels pretty good in motion, even if it looks a bit, frantic. Although the best part of combat has to be the game's range of voodoo magic, which both lets you run around like Mega Man as well as nuke giant insects. Magic in this game is obtained via these skulls that are dotted around each level. There's about 10 different spells in total, ranging from machine gun style blasts to AoE attacks, homing shots, shields that set enemies on fire or maybe absorb health with your melee attacks, or even this cool orb that locks enemies in place and then lets you wail on them to your heart's content, unless you are Akuji of course, who I would like to remind you is still Heartless. There's a few different ways that you can use your magic. You can stand locked in place and rotate around like a turret, run and gun, or even shoot in first person too, which is handy for sniping off enemies or maybe even solving the odd puzzle. Pretty much all of these magic abilities are useful throughout the game, and something that I quite like is that the magic you pick up is only usable in that level, meaning if you're the kind of person who has a habit of not using items because you're afraid you might need it later on, aka most of the people watching I'm sure, it's not a problem in this game since the magic is specific to each individual level, so you might as well use it instead of lose it. The only other items worth noting outside of the ancestors' heads and magic skulls are these totems, which if you manage to collect 100 of, permanently increases your health meter. There's also these blue orbs that are dropped by enemies which give you an extra life upon collecting 100, and these little and big hearts which sadly you can't use to replace your actual heart, but they do restore your health, which is basically the same thing, only worse. And yeah, that's pretty much the Akuji experience in a nutshell. Lots of platforming, the occasional bit of puzzle solving, and a whole bunch of enemies to destroy in cool and satisfying ways. It doesn't really do anything revolutionary or particularly exciting in the gameplay department, but I think there's something to be said about a game that does almost everything really, really well, and I think Akuji is that type of game. I always enjoyed the platforming, I always enjoyed the combat, and I always enjoyed running around the levels and picking up cool little items. In fact, I don't think there's a single level in this game that I didn't enjoy, and even in some of my favorite games, there's often parts in them that I dread playing, but Akuji, I think, is consistently good all the way through, which is a pretty impressive feat. Well, I say that, but there is some problems worth highlighting, although it's mostly the usual stuff you'd expect, namely the camera, which can be a bit of a bother at times and gets stuck behind the scenery, but even in saying that, it's mostly pretty good, and the autofocus and zoom feels really well tailored to each individual environment, so even if the game has the usual camera woes seen in this gen, it's still pretty good comparatively to others. The game's bosses, however, are unfortunately one of its weaker elements, and once again, it's not even that they're necessarily bad per se. I just found they died really quickly. Like, the fights themselves and the arenas they take place in were fun, it's just that your magic is often a little bit too effective for its own good. In fact, the whole game is really quite easy, I found, outside of a few of the later levels, although maybe that's just because I've come off playing Bubsy 3D and Barbie Explorer, and playing a platformer with decent controls kind of feels like I'm cheating at this stage. Although probably the game's biggest issue is its rather inconsistent frame rate, which you will notice taking quite a few dips throughout your playthrough. The game aims for 30 FPS throughout and does hit it more often than not, but plenty of areas and the more hectic fights will see it drop down to the high 10s and low 20s, so be prepared for that if you're the kind of person who cares about that sort of thing. But honestly, I found the game so enjoyable that it really didn't bother me in the slightest. So yeah, in spite of some jittery animations, inconsistent frame rates, easy difficulty, and PlayStation era camera controls, I thought this was a really fun game. And while the gameplay certainly plays a big part in that, the real selling point to me, and the thing that really made me love this game, was its presentation and atmosphere, which I gotta say, if you like blood, skulls, and miserable things, this is the game for you. Whether it's the game's oppressive hub full of demonic and satanic paintings that feel like a spooky version of a Crash Bandicoot warp room, complete with an invite to the local Discord, to the game's 13 individual levels, all of which sporting their own unique look and feel, from rain-soaked temples to pulsating blood-soaked whatever this is. Every level felt like a new experience, each with their own specific gimmicks and puzzles to solve, complete with weird enemies that are coming to maul you in very hideous ways. It's a game full of dark, interesting, and atmospheric locales with some absolutely wonderful lighting effects throughout, and I was never not excited to see what was coming up next. And of course, in the background, we also have the game's excellent music and sound design, which is consistently high quality throughout. We've already mentioned the voice work, which is really well done across the entire cast, both during in-game cutscenes and the brief CGI scenes, which are also quite gruesome as you'd expect. The sound effects used for things like magic and enemies are great, and there's even a few sounds that are shared between this and Gex, which is a fun thing to look out for if you're familiar with both. I also really like the way that the narrator says the name of a spell when you pick it up for the first time in a level. It always got me unnecessarily hyped to blast some enemies.
Fire burst. Energy blast.
The music though, if you can believe it, also pretty damn great, and probably this game's biggest secret weapon, as not many games sound like this one. Almost every track in this game is reliant on a heavy amount of drums of all shapes and sizes, giving it this dense tribal soundscape mixed in with a small selection of synths and other instruments that really give this game its signature sound. And something that I didn't even really notice until later in the game is how the music builds and changes as you move throughout the levels. It's so subtle in how it's done, but generally whenever you solve a puzzle or move into a new area, the music builds in intensity, and it's blended so well into the gameplay that I only really noticed it at the end of one of the levels when I had to stop and go, what the fuck, this music is insane. Also, shout out to the hub music, which is very unlike anything else in the game, but it is so cool and foreboding that I need to highlight it. So yeah, that's Akuji the Heartless. I managed to get 42 of the game's 52 ancestors in a total of about 3.5 hours, and that was enough to get me to the credits. And while admittedly it doesn't do anything revolutionary in the gameplay or narrative department, I gotta say, I adored this game from start to finish. I said it before and I'll say it again, a game doesn't have to reinvent the wheel to be worthwhile and stand out from the crowd. It can just do a whole bunch of stuff that's been done before, but really, really well. And for me, Akuji was a really fun, gory, and adult PS1 era platformer with some of the coolest visuals and atmosphere that the PlayStation has to offer, in my opinion. I kinda get why it flew under the radar back in the day, because let's be fair, the console was flooded with these types of games circa 1999, and at that stage, people were really expecting more revolution and new ideas when it came to their video games. But like, for somebody who in 2023 just loves a good throwback linear PS1 era platformer, this is one I really can't recommend enough. It's pretty cheap, it's really cool, and it lets you fire voodoo nukes at people. I mean, what more could you ask for, really? Akuji may be heartless, but his game certainly isn't. So if this seems like your kind of thing, absolutely 100% give it a try, or else a spooky dude in a top hat and sunglasses will haunt your dreams forevermore, and I can tell you from experience, that is something you do not want to happen.
The price I must pay for the sins of my family is high. I have been reduced from a prince to an indentured assassin. I seek to ensure the survival of my beloved Keisha, and to obtain it, I will kill and kill again. Soul Seeker.
You will provide.
We know of these alien tanks. They're used by the aliens to transport cyborgs about the city. Be careful. They're very heavily armed and can unleash fearsome firepower.
Rounding out today's volume, we have that cool game with the laser eye man that everybody had a demo of. That's right, it's C12 Final Resistance, which made its way to the PlayStation in 2001 for PAL players, or 2002 if you live in North America. This game was chosen by two fine folks, them being Tandem J over on YouTube and Vodka59 over on Patreon. And I have a feeling this might be a contentious inclusion in this video, because not only is this a first-party Sony game, one that was pretty heavily marketed, at least over here in Europe, but it also went on to become a platinum release, which in other words means it actually sold quite a lot of copies and is included alongside this rather large list of well-known games. And I suppose calling this title obscure, at least from a PAL perspective, probably isn't that accurate. But hey look, Loaded is in this list too, so all these videos are a lie. Now I bring this up because I always get at least one comment on these videos from somebody stating, hey, I know this game, this isn't obscure, and as always, congrats to that person for knowing every game. It's a very useful skill that will make you incredibly popular and well liked by everybody. But an important thing people sometimes forget is that these videos are called obscure and forgotten PS1 games, and C12 over here seems to be one of those prime games to receive that old classic comment wow, I completely forgot this game existed, and considering this is pretty much the last big first-party Western title on the console, it really doesn't get as much love or praise as many of Sony's other big first-party hits. Now maybe that's just a byproduct of it releasing just as the 6th gen of consoles were really beginning to hit their stride, or maybe it just wasn't all that good in the first place, and since I've only ever played a demo of this game in the past, well, today we're going to find out once and for all if this swan song to the PS1 era is still worth playing today. Now before we dig into C12, it's important to highlight this game's developer, Sony Computer Entertainment Cambridge, one of Sony's, at the time, multiple UK dev teams, and one of the more interesting ones in my opinion. Now before they were purchased by Sony, they went by the name Millennium Interactive and developed a couple of odd PS1 games during its early years, but more notably, they also developed that Frogger game everybody had, which ended up becoming one of the highest selling games in the console's history. So naturally, Sony decided to buy them up and rename them Sony Computer Entertainment Cambridge. And while that name might not be too familiar to you, their first game released under Sony, Medieval, is probably one of Sony's most well-known first-party PlayStation titles, and a personal favourite of mine. I'm not going to say it's the most polished or advanced game from a tech or gameplay perspective, but it's such a charming and lovely little game, and probably my all-time favourite Halloween game. Well, assuming I'm in the mood for something lighthearted and, you know, not terrifying. And something that's always stood out to me about Cambridge Studios games since the release of Medieval is that they kind of became Sony's ultimate first-party 7 out of 10 studio, making these very impressive but often flawed and kinda janky video games. Games that had a lot of budget and marketing behind them, but never really seemed to grab people's attention in the same way Sony's other first-party titles did. I mean, a good example of this is Medieval 2, which arguably is a much better game than the first, but it's one that I almost never see talked about these days, which is odd considering how beloved the first game is. Their PS2 releases are even more interesting because I remember them all receiving huge amounts of press and marketing at the time. I mean, you all remember Primal, right? The game that lets you live out the fantasy of being a hot goth girl in the year 2003, complete with tribal tattoo and gargoyle companion. It even got a special edition over here with a complimentary CD of Crazy Town music and a subscription card to the Primal fan club. They really don't make them like they used to. And of course, who could forget Ghostmaster, which in my opinion is probably their very best game, a nice action-heavy horror title that's about a cop that accidentally releases a bunch of imprisoned ghosts around Detroit. It's exactly as dumb as it sounds, but you do get to fight a giant haunted teddy bear, so that's pretty cool. They also made the PS2 exclusive 24 game, which I haven't played before, but now that I know it's a late-release first-party PS2 title, it really makes me want to check it out. Anyway, I think the important thing to note here is that while Cambridge Studio were quite prolific under Sony, I don't feel they ever really had a hit as big as the original Medieval, or even Frogger for that matter, which absolutely eclipsed Medieval in sales. But in between those Medieval games and their PS2 work, of course, we got C12 Final Resistance, a game that kind of perfectly encapsulates their strengths and weaknesses as a studio. C12 takes place in a post-apocalyptic futuristic Britain that's been ravaged by alien invaders who are looking to harvest all our sweet, sweet carbon. That's what the C12 in the name is in reference to, by the way. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the humans ain't doing all that well, as they're either being killed en masse, or worse yet, captured by the aliens and sent off to processing plants to be turned into evil cyborgs. But in a last-ditch effort to stage a comeback against the alien invaders, our protagonist, Lieutenant Riley Vaughn, a member of Earth's resistance force, agrees to be kitted out with some stolen alien tech, and is now part cyborg, part human, and all badass. It's kind of like a mixture of RoboCop, the Terminator, and Quake 2, but it's also full of polite British people. It's actually quite odd, but we'll talk a little more about the story later. All you need to know for now is that everything is grim and terrible, so a pretty good representation of living in modern day Britain, only if you had a cool sword and a laser eye. As for the gameplay, well, it's a third-person action game featuring a steady mixture of gunplay, exploration, and puzzle solving. The game is split into 6 different missions, which doesn't really sound like a whole lot, but the missions are often quite lengthy, taking anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes to beat on average. These missions are usually broken up into segments that kind of act like their own individual levels, but they are weaved together quite seamlessly as you progress from one area to the next, so you never really notice any lulls or breaks in the gameplay. These missions often contain boss fights and various action set pieces throughout, which is nice, but interestingly, the missions mostly take place in these larger maps that often fluctuate between linear and non-linear progression, requiring you to explore every nook and cranny, seeking out items and keys to help you solve whatever objective the Resistance currently needs. And once you've completed that, you can then move on to the next objective in that area, or even a whole new area to explore entirely. It's a pretty fun, if derivative formula for a third-person action game, but I think C12 luckily has enough variety to its puzzles, enemies and locales that it manages to stay engaging and keeps things feeling fresh as you move throughout the game. Sure, there's a lot of color-based puzzles and plenty of blocks to move around, but they do manage to spice things up consistently throughout, and overall the level and puzzle design is pretty good as far as PS1 games go. But enough about that boring stuff. How fun is it to shoot aliens? And the answer to that is fun, but not as fun as you think. Now, as this is a 2001 release, you'd expect some semi-modern controls utilizing the dual analog sticks, right? And I'm delighted to say, not only do we have analog movement, but a camera tied to the right stick as well. Hallelujah. Of course, as is tradition, being granted modern controls in a PS1 game always comes with a catch, and in this case, it's the combo of the right stick always snapping your view back to the center once you let go of it, and the camera always being set to inverted with no way to toggle it off. You know, it's surprisingly hard to retrain your brain to learn inverted controls once you've spent decades doing the exact opposite. It is manageable, but just on the off chance you see me looking the wrong way during gameplay, that is probably the reason why. Other than that, you've got a button to shoot regular shots, and there's also a button for your weapon's alt fire, which all weapons have and are generally quite useful. You've also got a shield which can block all damage for you while it's held up. Your usage of this is limited and you do need to find items to refill it, but it is incredibly useful. You can also double tap the shield button if you like to use an EMP, which is not very useful and also wastes your entire shield, so yeah. Don't use it. There's also a button to interact with things, a button to climb objects, and a button to crouch, which is quite handy for a little bit of stealth action, and also killing people via stealth action. You've got a first person mode, which is also handy for killing things and killing things via stealth, but it also doubles up as a scanner that can give you useful information about enemies and objects in the surrounding area. Plus, it also looks really cool, so that's pretty neat. And last but not least, we have the all-important lock-on button, which will probably be your best friend and your worst enemy when it comes to killing enemies in this game. As for weapons, you start with this cool little alien blade, which you can use to take down enemies with a 3-hit combo. It's also needed on occasion to get rid of some alien webbing around the environment, but hey, if you've got a big sword, you might as well use it to get rid of some webbing. Although, in spite of your cool sword, 99% of your combat encounters in-game will involve guns, both man-made and alien-made. Early on, you get access to an assault rifle and grenade launcher combo, which will really be your workhorse throughout the game. Later, you'll get a rocket launcher for taking out bigger enemies, and then in the latter half of the game, you'll start to pick up some alien weaponry that makes shooting bad guys a whole lot more colorful, which is always nice. These weapons aren't really anything too outlandish. I mean, you will have seen pretty much all of them before, but I will say the game does a good job of balancing the weapons to the point where every single weapon feels useful up until the very end of the game, so kudos to them there. Although, as I mentioned, the game also features a light stealth system, one that you'll only really need to use in a handful of situations, but I'd recommend making the most of it whenever possible, not just because fighting enemies head on is a very good way to lose your health, but because shooting them in the head while crouching is the cool guy way of doing things. Other than that, you've got a few consumable items that you can pick up, like health packs, shield charges, and ammo. Plus, there are some items that you can hang on to for later, like the rare alien health, which gives you a full heal if you manage to find 2 of them, and also these alien spores that can be combined to create a flashbang, a light for dark areas, or ideally a corrosive acid, which can unblock rusty passages. All in all, it seems like the making of a pretty good game, and while it oftentimes is, unfortunately some rather unrefined controls and combat often put a dampener on the overall experience. The camera stuff, as previously mentioned, is pretty annoying, but it's something that you can manage with a bit of practice, but even still, the sensitivity for aiming is way too sensitive to really make first-person aiming reliable in stressful situations, and the camera angles occasionally pop into places that they probably shouldn't. Now, in spite of those issues, they shouldn't really be too much of a problem thanks to the game's lock-on system, but unfortunately, that kind of sucks too. Now, it's not a particularly fancy lock-on. You press the button and it locks you onto an enemy. You can't do headshots, but you can shoot the enemy while moving, so you know, what's not to love? Well, sadly, the game has this very weird quirk where if you strafe a little too far to the left or right, your character decides to turn away from the enemy and you lose your lock-on. Now, this is bad, right? But even more annoyingly, if you decide to run backwards while locked onto an enemy, it makes your character turn around and you also lose your lock. Now, I don't know about you guys, but my standard gameplay for shooters with lock-ons is to walk side to side and occasionally backwards if I'm feeling a little bit sassy. In this game, doing that does not work at all, and it feels very bad because of it. Now, you might forgive it for being an early example of a 3D game using this style of lock-on system, but many games on the console released prior to this utilized a very similar lock-on system, most notable of which is the much older first-party title Siphon Filter, which, in my opinion, has a great lock-on system. And funnily enough, one of the biggest criticisms of C12 from reviewers at the time was that this whole game feels very much like Siphon Filter, but now in the future, and it's worse. And while I don't fully agree with that statement, its combat camera and movement do feel like a less polished version of Siphon Filter, and while once again you can get used to C12's quirks, I'd be lying if I said that they didn't bother me throughout my entire playthrough. And ironically, the fact that it has a control scheme that's relatively close to the modern ones that we use today probably ages it more than a game that simply used the bog standard PS1 D-pad scheme, because you kind of expect a PS1 game to be a little bit janky and of its era. But this one stands out in particular because it's familiar to what you'd use today, but really bad. The whole game, unfortunately, is rather janky at times. Melee combat is quite powerful but has awful feedback and just feels terrible in action. Like, for example, Akuji's combat looks janky but feels pretty good, whereas this game's melee attacks look better but feel much worse, to the point where I rarely ever use the sword in my playthrough, and it's a crime to have a weapon like this in the game and not have your player want to use it. There's also a bunch of occasions where I had difficulty interacting with things in the environment, like climbing walls or pressing switches, or even just finding the right locations to use items. You sometimes need to stand in very specific places to use them, and if you happen to check that area but miss the right spot, it can leave you wandering a level for quite a while, just wondering what you might have missed. Another aspect which I found quite odd was the save and checkpoint system. So during missions, there's usually a number of save points, which unsurprisingly let you save your game, and for the most part, these are quite plentiful throughout the game and spaced out pretty well, and you can also save at the end of each mission, which is quite handy too. But unfortunately, there was a series of events that left me in a pretty bad spot thanks to this system. You see, at the end of the second mission, there's a timed escape sequence. Now, I didn't know where I had to go during this sequence, and I also had quite low health, so I panicked a little and just ran to wherever I could and accidentally found my way out of the level. Great stuff. Saved my game and onto the next mission. The problem, however, is that the game does not refill your health from mission to mission, so I started this new mission on basically a single point of health, and if you die, which, surprise, I did, you gotta go back to the main menu, load your save point, and then you're back again with 1 HP. Now this admittedly is an unfortunate bit of luck that probably won't happen to everybody, but it made this opening section of the third mission a nightmare. Now I thought to myself, look, all I have to do is find a single health pickup. There's got to be something around here. And if you can believe it, this entire section, which is not that easy by the way, had one single health pickup during it, and it was a small one at that, near the very end of the segment. I died so many times here that I legit thought I might need to outright restart the game, which clearly is not ideal. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you might not even experience during your playthrough, but if it does happen to you, it's also the kind of thing that might make you stop playing outright. So, yeah, not great. Now, to turn this into a positive, the experience did teach me the importance of stealth, headshots, and more notably, how incredibly overpowered and effective your shield is. Like, if you wanted to, you could probably run through most of this game with your shield up and straight up ignore all the enemies. So at least my experiences in the 1 HP trenches made me a better Cyberman than before, even if I'd rather personally not experience it again. And to be honest, even though this game does have some issues that detracted from my enjoyment of it quite a bit, it's really quite the shame, because generally what this game does well, it does very well, and that's pretty much everything else in it. I thought the level design and environments were really cool and had fun puzzles and objectives throughout. Like, I love using your scanner to detect mines in the ground and pulling corpses into medical facilities to retrieve alien scanners. It sounds weird, but it's pretty cool. The boss fights are also really well done and generally quite tough as well. It starts out feeling like you're really under-equipped to fight these things, but soon bosses become regular enemies that you can take out with ease, and when it throws a big bad alien enemy at you, you often need to think outside the box to take it out, which I really enjoyed. The last boss, however, is a huge difficulty spike, and I probably would have struggled against it way more if I didn't stock up on all my healing items for this very moment. A rare situation where doing that actually paid off greatly, so yeah, take a note of that. But if there's one thing I think really saves this game and makes it worth playing, is its presentation and atmosphere, which can be pretty incredible at times. The game does a really good job of making you feel like you're part of a resistance that's fighting against unwinnable odds. The game moves from these bombed out ruined streets into smaller underground resistance bases, and later these alien plants that have been kitted out to turn humans into cyborg warriors, who you spend most of the early parts of the game fighting, by the way, which is mildly terrifying, and then later actually infiltrating these proper alien headquarters and bases, which are easily the highlight of the game on a visual level, featuring some lovely dark and twisted design. It's really good stuff for a PS1 game, and in particular, there's some fantastic lighting effects and texture work seen throughout. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's the most polished or technically impressive PS1 game out there, as you will see the odd glitch or camera malfunction from time to time, but it looks and feels like a late release title, and it's making good use of some of the cooler techniques that artists have brought to the console over the years, and that goes for the enemies too, which consistently feature some rather menacing designs and get more and more twisted as you go deeper into enemy territory. But the star is of course our main character, Lieutenant Vaughn, who doesn't really look all that impressive outside of his really cool laser eye, which you also see on walls and stuff, which is pretty cool. But even cooler, okay, spoiler warning here if you care greatly about the plots of 20-year-old games, during the last mission, Lieutenant Riley gets the Quake 4 treatment and becomes more cyborg than human, and is quite the mess now. But hey, 2 laser eyes are better than 1. I don't think anybody will disagree there. Now, while the visuals certainly play a big part in this game's appeal, I gotta give a special shout out to the sound design as well, which does a great job at maintaining the right level of atmosphere throughout the game. You might have some sections that are dead silent and tense, others with ominous drones and strange sounds in the background, or maybe even the sounds of combat happening right outside your building. Although, of course, when the big action kicks in, it's PS1 jungle time, baby, which we absolutely love to see. Also, shout out to the main menu, which features a stone cold banger. Another thing I don't normally highlight but kinda have to hear is that the rumble features in this game are really, really good. Now, I always play my games with rumble on because I'm an extreme dude after all, but rarely do I notice its implementation like I have in this game. Somebody spent a lot of time tuning the rumble to various sound effects, everything from gunshots and explosions to footsteps and alien cries. You can feel in your controller, and it actually puts some PS5 games to shame. So yeah, whoever looked after that, great job. Your work has not gone unnoticed. I suppose the only thing I've really left to talk about here is the voice acting and story, which I'm not really sure is good or bad. I think the story overall is pretty good. It's very grim and not a happy game, that's for sure. You basically suffer constant setback after setback throughout this entire thing, and I found the opening mission briefings quite funny because it almost always starts by telling you the one thing we didn't want to happen has happened, and then the next mission is like, well, we didn't think it could get any worse, but it has. And then the next mission is like, Jesus Christ, we're gonna die. And I gotta say, I enjoyed that a lot. The voice acting, on the other hand, while admittedly quite good and professional, kind of ruins the tone of the story for me. Lieutenant Riley Vaughn is basically a very posh Englishman who is incredibly bored about everything happening around him. Your colonel is more or less a parody of British World War II generals, and the main antagonist thread the game might as well be a Doctor Who villain twirling his mustache and not some sort of evil cyborg man. The tone of these performances are so out of place with the grim situation they are in that it kind of goes into the realms of being a little bit funny, which I do like, but I really don't think that was their intention. Like, some of these scenes sound like they're out of an ITV period drama, which is a very specific reference, but quite accurate, I feel.
What a breakthrough. This could really turn things around for us. We'd better move it though. They'll be sending reinforcements as we speak.
Have you heard from Grisham?
I'll contact him. Now. Oh my God. No!
Nice to see you too, darling. Do you like my new uniform? Makes a nice change from tacky pips, don't you think?
That can't be you. It's not you, is it, Dan?
I'll be returning with the woman. You lot clear this up.
Where are we now? I can't see a way out of here.
I can't either, Riley. It's like a maze in here. We're lost.
This doesn't feel right. I don't like this at all.
Isn't that a control room up there? Cover me while I climb up and take a look. Riley, what was that? What's up with this door? Why won't it open? Oh no, it's...
Locked, I think was the word you're searching for, darling. Though tiresome was the one that immediately sprung to my mind.
Riley, it's him! It's Dan! Watch out!
How very eloquent, dear. Well, I would love to chew the fat with you two, but killing you both will be far more enjoyable.
Carter, your threats are every bit as convincing as your pitiful leadership. You always were a dead loss. Only now, you really look the part.
What took you so long, Vaughn? It never stood a chance. Anything to do with Dan.
You'll pay for this, bitch! You and your retarded little action man.
Oh, come on, you loser. Is that really the best you can do?
You won't be laughing shortly. Anyway, I've far more important things to do. I'll have to kill you both later. And I'll enjoy that immensely.
Anyway, that's C12 Final Resistance, a game I wasn't really enjoying when I started playing it, but really grew to enjoy and appreciate by the end. And while it doesn't really offer anything new or exciting in the world of third-person action games, if you think you can overcome some awkward combat and camera controls, it's one of the more atmospheric and dark games to make it to the PlayStation, and one I think a lot of people would quite enjoy for its cool visual elements alone. Now sadly, this is kind of the case for most of Cambridge Studios' games. Cool settings, great characters, excellent visuals, all topped off with some janky ass gameplay that kind of drags down the whole experience. Now if you're wondering whatever happened to Cambridge Studio, well, after making 24 on the PS2, they kind of floundered around a little, handling the PSP port of Little Big Planet, and also that game TV Superstars on PS3, which was peak bland Sony, let me tell you. Although not long after, they had a bit of a resurgence, becoming a sister team, the Killzone developer Guerrilla, and being renamed Guerrilla Cambridge, where they made the very good Killzone Mercenaries on the Vita and the pretty overlooked VR mech sports game Riggs. And then shortly after, Sony killed them because they're the worst. A sadly familiar tale for British studios working under Sony. But hey, I'll always appreciate Cambridge Studio for making interesting and memorable games, and also a dude with 2 big laser eyes, which, let's be fair, is pretty fucking cool, isn't it?
Come on! Just a couple of seconds. Open, goddammit! Got it!
Well, there you go. That was a look at 5 games that made it to the original PlayStation. Some you might never have heard of, and some you probably have, but I hope it was entertaining and informative all the same. And let's be fair, if it wasn't, you probably would have turned the video off at this point, so we won't worry about it too much. We got to check out a cool PAL-exclusive beat-em-up that lets you turn bad people into frogs, a duo of British top-down shooters with some great music and disgusting imagery, a cool game about a voodoo man who jumps a lot in the hopes of coming back to life, and a game that answers the age-old question, what's cooler than 1 laser eye? That's right, 2 laser eyes. A fun mixture of games for sure, but the time for fun is over, because it's now the most serious part of the video where my cats decide which game is best, except for Legend, which I still don't own. Seriously, it's very expensive. But in all seriousness, it's ranking time. Were any of these games must-plays? Are they worth trying if you like the look of them? Maybe they were just kinda meh? Or are they absolutely not worth your time and instead belong in the trash? Well, Volume 15 selection sees Reloaded make it into the meh tier, Legend, Loaded and C12 making it into the try tier, and Akuji may not have a heart, but he sure did win mine, giving us yet another must-play. You love to see it. Now, I'll start out with both Loaded and Reloaded, and while these two are very similar aesthetically and on a basic gameplay level, the changes to the level design and combat really just end up making Reloaded a worse version of Loaded, a game that, at the time, was already a little too simple and repetitive for its own good. But to its credit, its cool cast of characters, excellent music, and simple, straightforward gameplay make it a fun, casual playthrough, even today. Well, as long as you enjoy it in short bursts. Reloaded, on the other hand, in spite of some really out there visuals, great music, and some small level highlights, is just loaded with a gimped combat system, larger, more confusing levels, and probably the most annoying boulders ever put in a video game. If you try Loaded and like what you played, well, there's no harm giving Reloaded a try as well, but the original is undoubtedly the better of the two. As for Legend, well, we got to check out one of the most arcadey beat-em-ups the PlayStation has to offer, a love letter to the genre packed full of silly additions and flourishes that'll be sure to make any fan of beat-em-ups smile. It's a shame the sluggish gameplay doesn't really match up to the colourful visuals and sound, but I can't imagine many beat-em-up fans not digging this game. Just go in expecting a good time over perfection, and you'll probably have as much fun playing this as the team in Toka clearly had making it. When it comes to C12, however, this is a game I really wasn't feeling early on into my playthrough. The awkward nature of the controls, camera, and lock-on system made it feel like I was fighting with the controller more than actually focusing on the gameplay. But once I got used to things, experimented more with its stealth and weapons, and really began to appreciate the dark environments and atmosphere, I really grew to like this one by the end. It's a game that gets better and better the more you get into it, and while it certainly has some issues that I think will bother less patient players, if you're in the mood for a dark and gritty sci-fi shooter with great graphics and lots of polite British people, well, you can certainly do a lot worse than this, and it's also rather cheap to buy, so why the hell not? And for a game that I'm not sure people will agree with my placement of, Akuji the Heartless, I just really enjoyed. It's admittedly also probably in the 7 out of 10 ballpark alongside C12 because of some unfortunate issues, but I think the difference here is that the elements of jank to its movement and combat and the simplicity of its overall game design doesn't really take away from my enjoyment of the game in the same way C12's problems do. Like, yeah, there's parts of it that could be better, but I'm not gonna lie, I enjoyed every single level in this game. I look forward to picking it back up every time I have to play it, and I think it's just this lovely example of a pure classic PS1 era platformer with this adult voodoo twist that makes it stand out from the crowd. It's just a really fun game, and I don't think every single title has to be perfect to be considered a must-play. I mean, this game certainly isn't, but I feel confident enough in saying, if you play Akuji, you will probably really enjoy it. So yeah, that's a must-play for me right there. Now before we finish up, I'd of course like to give a shout out to the wheels chosen this episode, so give it up for Nocturnal for Legend, Mr. Default himself, RJ Badman for Loaded, Russie B Cool, Murpheus93, and Ginge for Reloaded, Danfra Plus for Akuji the Heartless, and last but not least, Tandem J and Vodka59 for C12 Final Resistance. Congrats on being the wheels chosen, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my fiancée Orla, who once again returned to provide some co-op footage for this video. Her favourite game of this episode was Reloaded because she enjoyed Loaded and thought this one was more colourful, and since she's the gamer of the house, you should probably take her word over mine, so Reloaded gets this volume's bonus Orla stamp of approval. Great job. And of course, I'd like to give a very special shout out to my lovely Patreon supporters who continue to make videos like this possible, including fine folk like Adam Hartzell, Alan Caslin, Bloody Cassie, Callow Mello, Danny, Dave Nolan, Disc Kun, the mascot for the Famicom Disc System, Doma, Gerard Winter, Globe99, Howie, Ice Light, Kyle Winter, Meester Papala, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshmon, Nathan McMullen, Richard Kramer, SN Kierstead, and finally Spectre117, who have all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. And finally, last but not least, a big thank you to you at home or wherever you are for watching this video. I'll be back again with some more PS1 content in the not too distant future, but until then, take it easy, look after yourselves, and I'll talk to you again real soon. See ya!